Hello everybody, how's the sound? Okay. My name is Jessica Sullivan and I work here in Kissimmee at the University of Florida, Osceola County Extension. And I teach lots of different agricultural topics normally, anything from pollinators and beekeeping to teaching people how to run their businesses and figure out what crops to grow. So I'm pretty diversified that way, but beekeeping is one of my favorite topics, so I'm glad to be here tonight and share a little bit about my experiences and the history of beekeeping. And thanks for letting me be with you. Start over. Okay, the bees that we're going to talk about today are the European honeybees, which are the kind of managed honeybees that people keep in hives in the United States. So all of the weird names all over this map here are types of European honeybees and their subspecies. So the subspecies that we have here originate from all of these different kinds of bees up here. And then we also have an African honeybee, which is the same species but a different subspecies that originates from southern Africa. So a little bit of background on bees and humans and how they came to know each other. So one of the first records we have of humans and bees interacting comes from some art on a cliff wall depicting a honey hunter. So back then, before people knew how to keep bees, they would simply rob the hives of the honey. And in Egypt, they had pretty sophisticated methods of beekeeping in clay cylinder hives. That was over 5,000 years ago. And those are just the records that we actually had of it. It was probably happening long before then. And in Israel, over 3,000 years ago, there were clay cylinder beehives, and they kept these actually in the middle of a major city and kept hundreds of beehives. And in Cozumel, the Mayans kept the Melipona, the stingless honeybees. They're a much tinier bee, and throughout South America, this is the type of bee that they keep. But they don't call it beekeeping there, they call it Melipona culture. And the Mayans kept these types of bees in clay and log beehives over 2,000 years ago. And in Japan, they've been beekeeping for thousands of years, and there are records at least 400 years ago of them coming up with pretty sophisticated methods of honey harvesting without destroying hives. And you'll see why that's significant here in a moment. And in Italy, we have records of wooden board hives, which were some of the forebears of our common hives that we use now. And some of the first bees that we have record of coming into the United States were brought by the English into Jamestown, Virginia in the 1600s. But they've done some DNA testing on bees near St. Augustine, Florida, and there's some Spanish genetics there. So it's hypothesized that some of the first bees to this continent were probably from the Spanish, and they probably arrived in the 1500s. So even as early as the 1870s, migratory beekeeping, or moving bees around on a regular basis, was in practice. So there was a route on a steamship from New York to Florida, traveling to and from there for honey production and for pollinating crops in both places. And then they were shipped on trains on land with ice and fans to keep the bees from roasting to death. And here you see a wagon with lots of beehives on it. Beehives are really heavy, and there are lots of heavy, stinging creatures in them, so it requires some care to move them around on land or water. And even now, you'll see the picture on the bottom there, a barge with beehives on it. That is still a practice that's done to take advantage of the Ogeechee Tupelo bloom to get some Tupelo honey up in North Florida. So the skep hive is probably what you have seen depicted in a lot of older beekeeping drawings, and these hives were made out of reeds woven together, and they were as simple as they look. And inside, the picture in the upper right-hand side there is what the honeycomb looked like with the bees on it when they would nest inside of those skeps. But the problem with the skeps is that you would have to destroy a lot of the comb and a lot of the baby bees inside the comb, and probably a lot of the bees as well, just to harvest the honey out of it. So it wasn't a very sustainable or nice method of beekeeping that was done for a long, long time. The Langstroth Hive was actually invented by a Philadelphian here in the US back in the 1800s, and it happened after he discovered that bee space was a thing. And what this means is that he discovered there was a certain amount of space from 1/4 of an inch to 3/8 of an inch between the frames or between the honeycombs that the bees would keep when they built honeycomb naturally. And so this allowed him to create a fake hive with the same dimensions that the bees would make in their own hives. And so that was the first movable frame beehive that we had. So that really revolutionized beekeeping, as simple of an invention as that was. And this type of box with basically these same dimensions are still used today as the primary way that commercial and backyard beekeepers keep their bees, because you can remove the frames without harming the bees, you can harvest the honey from them, and that's a big deal. So here's just an example of how bees will build their comb if they're doing it naturally. So it's pretty thick and it's in all of these wavy layers, and they'll build it any which way depending on the space that they're in. The picture in the middle there shows a Langstroth frame with honeycomb built on it, and there are wires in between to keep the frame, to keep the honeycomb from falling out when you pick it up and move it around. The picture on the bottom there is a plastic foundation frame, and the plastic is imprinted with the honeycomb pattern, and the bees will just build their honeycomb right on top of it, and it makes it even easier for us to move these frames around and to harvest honey and then replace those empty frames for the bees to reuse and fill with honey the next season. So with the history of beekeeping, one of the big things that was finally discovered and named is this nasty spore-forming bacteria, and they named the disease American Foulbrood. And it really devastated apiaries, and a lot of beekeepers really were hit hard with this disease because it doesn't go away, and it can kill out a lot of colonies and make them very unhealthy, and it spreads a lot. So in response to this American Foulbrood becoming so bad in this country, in Florida, the beekeepers here in the early 1900s actually talked to the state of Florida and asked to start an apiary inspection program. And even to this day, Florida has a very strong apiary inspection program that is used as an example throughout the world, actually. And in 1920, the Florida State Beekeeper Association started, and it still exists today.
We have a question. Would you like to take it now?
Sure.
The question is, for the migratory bees on barges, how did the bees find their way back? How successful was this style of beekeeping? This is from Carissa Moff.
Okay, so we have a question from the audience about how successful was migratory beekeeping and
On barges.
on barges, and how did the bees find their way back to the barges?
Carissa,
Is that right?
does it have to do with how did the bees find their way back to the barges after they left? After they've left to forage for the day?
So bees have to, wherever they are, they go out, they have to find flowers, and then they're very good communicators, and so they communicate with each other on where those sources of forage are, and as they are coming out of the hives, they're orienting themselves as to the direction of the sun and where to get back to the hive. So they're pretty good navigators if the barge doesn't move, you know, from day to day. So it's an anchored barge, if that answers the question. So just a little bit of a look of Florida beekeepers and what we have going on right now. Beekeeping has exploded in popularity in recent years, and I'm talking even during my career in the past like 5 years, beekeeping has, you know, more than doubled in its in the number of beekeepers. So we have almost 5,000 registered beekeepers. They're registered with the state of Florida, and 85% of these are backyard beekeepers. And about 15% of them are the commercial, so they're making money off of their bees. But of these 630 colonies that are kept, 95% of those colonies are owned by the commercial side of things. So they're owned by about 5% of all of the beekeepers. And one of the major challenges that we're facing right now, not only because beekeeping is becoming popular, but mostly because land is decreasing in areas that people can keep bees. So that's one of the major challenges we have here in Florida for beekeeping, is where do you put, you know, 100 hives or 10,000 hives or 100,000 hives? So I'd like to give you a little bit of introduction to a bee colony. So bees are what they call social insects, and in Florida, bees live in colonies of about 10,000 bees. And the things that determine sociality in insects are these three things. So they have a reproductive division of labor, and that just means that each honeybee colony consists of a queen and workers and drones, and each of these honeybee castes has a very clearly defined role that isn't performed by any other caste. They also have cooperative brood care, which means that the worker bees take care of the babies. The babies aren't just hatched out and left to fend for themselves. And there are overlapping generations. So the honeybee queens can live several years and coexist in the colony with their offspring, which are the workers and the drones. Bee colonies are also known as superorganisms, and you've probably heard something about this in the latest scientific literature and media posts. And what this means is that each bee is like a single cell within an animal, and bees within the colony work together to perform these colony-level tasks, just like cells like in a human body or an animal. And so some examples of that would be temperature regulation. So a bee on its own can't regulate the temperature of the hive, but all together, if that hive starts getting to anything less than about 93 degrees, then they will make it warmer. And it's that temperature that allows the baby brood to hatch out and to be healthy. Individual bees are cold-blooded, but together they're all considered warm-blooded because they can regulate their temperature as a unit. Also, respiration is another important function that bees together can do. And so what that means is like they're fanning all of the time. They're circulating air in and out of the hive, and they're doing this all in coordination. Reproduction is not just a single queen laying thousands of eggs, which is what happens, but the honeybee colony reproduces when it creates a new honeybee colony. And so this process is actually called swarming. And swarming is when a hive decides to split. Like as a unit, they decide, hey, we've run out of space. It's time to reproduce. And so half of the colony will leave with the queen, and the old colony is left to produce a new queen. So it's kind of an interesting concept that, like, you know, a single honeybee can't live on its own, but together they function as basically one animal. So inside of a colony, there are honeybee castes, and there are 3 honeybee castes. The majority of the honeybees in a hive, like 95% of these, or probably like 90% of these, are going to be worker bees, and they're all females. They're all sisters that were laid by the queen. And drones are maybe 10% to 15% of the bees in the colony. The drones are the males. And then there is usually one laying queen, and it's her sole job to lay eggs, and she's tended to by the female worker bees in the hive, and the other worker bees in the hive actually kind of determine what the operations of the hive are going to be based on the conditions. We haven't really figured out what the role of the drones in the hive is. Not much, as far as anybody can tell. Their sole purpose that has been studied is they go out of the hive about a mile away and they mate with other virgin queens from different hives. And so here is just a little bit of an overview of the different things that worker bees do after they hatch. So as soon as a worker bee hatches out, it has a job to do, and it's a very specific job. It cleans out its cell and gets it prepared for more eggs to be laid in that cell, and then as a couple days later, it turns into a nurse bee, and it's taking care of its other sisters in the cells and tending to the brood, we call them, the baby bees. And then a few days after that, their role as a worker changes, and they become builders, and they start producing wax. And bees actually produce their own wax out of their bodies. And then they become guards for the hive, and they protect the hive. And then their last job as a worker bee is to become a forager. And worker bees go out and forage for a lot of different things, actually. Flower nectar, of course, what they make honey out of, but also pollen, which serves as baby bee food, and plant sap, which they make propolis out of. I'll show a photo in a minute. And they also bring water into the hive. So just a quick review on what pollination is, because we talk a lot about pollination when we talk about bees. So sometimes pollen needs to be transferred within a flower, sometimes it's between flowers on the same plant, and oftentimes, and especially where we need bees, is when it's between flowers on different plants. And so what pollination means for a lot of crops is actually pretty sophisticated, and it can actually mean that you get a lot more fruit from a plant, you get higher quality fruit, sweetness, extended shelf life, which turns into reduced food waste and food loss, and also, in the big picture, increased food security. And I like to show this picture of, what your grocery store looks like with bees and without bees. So that second photo there is what we would have if there were no bees. And we would have a problem is what we would have, because those shelves are pretty empty. So here are just a few Florida crops that benefit from bee pollination. So things from avocado, gourd, squash, cucumber, watermelon, cantaloupe, grapes. Some of them absolutely have to have insect pollination, and some of them will do a lot better and have higher quality fruit and more fruit if they have insect pollination. So a lot of people don't realize that bee pollination of different crops is usually a migratory practice. And so shown in this picture are some of the roots that are taken by various migratory beekeepers. So you'll see here that a lot of beekeepers from Florida send their bees up to pollinate mostly almonds in California, and this is done early in the spring. And then a lot of times they'll come back to Florida and pollinate blueberries or other spring crops in Florida. And you'll see the roots go all over the US. And so other beekeepers in other states will bring their bees down to Florida to overwinter, so it's not as harsh on their bees and they can stay more productive, maybe even make some honey during seasons when it wouldn't be as productive in their home state. So in terms of what this means for the bees is it can be pretty stressful on them, and it also means that bees from all over the United States are in the same places and they're interacting. So the potential for things like pests and diseases to spread is pretty high amongst migratory bees. So another beekeeping enterprise which sometimes goes along with pollination services and sometimes it doesn't, but honey production, of course. So in Florida we have two major honey production seasons, and the first one is in the spring, and there you'll have things like the citrus, orange blossom honey, and then later in the fall, and that will be things like the terrible exotic invasive Brazilian pepper, as well as things like goldenrod and other honey crops that are fall blooming. And bees are often moved around to locations where honey plants are blooming. And so these photos just show a full frame of honey. We cut the caps off of the honey frame, we put it in extractors, and this one's just a small extractor, and using centrifugal force it throws the honey out, and then you can bottle it up. And so the products you can get from bees, of course, are honey, and honey is directly and only nectar from flowering plants. However, when the bees ingest the honey, it goes into a special little honey stomach, and then they regurgitate it out. So it's not in their digestive system, it's in a special little honey stomach, and they pass that off to other bees in the hive, which then put it into cells, and then the honey or the nectar is dried down to a point where it's kind of sticky, and then it's capped over with a wax, and then it's stored for future use. And we discovered at some point in time, thank goodness, that bees actually make excess honey, so that allows us to harvest some of the honey. Beeswax is actually created by bees. It's a bee product, it's not a plant product, and so the sugars found in collected nectar are converted by the honeybees into beeswax. It takes a lot of nectar for a single bee to make even the tiniest little bit of beeswax. And of course the wax is used for things like candles and beauty products, and it's actually right now on the market worth more than the honey itself. It's selling for more. Propolis is another product that is now being studied, researched worldwide by scientists and medical professionals for all of its human benefits. And so it's actually very medicinally valuable. It has antiviral, antifungal, antibacterial properties if it's in a pure form. Be careful if you go searching for it though, because origin of some of the propolis out on the market is kind of unknown, and it's not very heavily regulated, so you may not really know what you're getting. But for the bees, it's also very valuable because they coat the inside of their hives and various, they use it to close up spaces. It's called bee glue because it's very sticky stuff. So it's kind of annoying for us as beekeepers because we have to pry the frames out and pry the lids off of our hives because of this propolis. But it's very valuable for the bees, and it helps them prevent diseases and pests in their hives as well. Pollen is another product that, of course, it's valuable for the bees, and if we collect it for human use, then we have to be careful not to collect very much at any one time, because this is what the bees will actually feed their young. And they'll mix it together with the honey and let it ferment, and this is bee bread, so it's a very nutritious product for the bee brood. And it's actually becoming pretty trendy in cute little restaurants. They'll use it for salad toppings and things like that. It tastes pretty good. And another significant enterprise in beekeeping is actually bee production and sales, because beekeepers here, we lose about 30 to 50% of all of our hives every single year. Like, literally lose them. The bees die. This is due to a number of issues, but primarily varroa mite issues, and we'll talk about that pest in a minute. And so with this being the case, in order for beekeepers to keep up with their production and have enough bees to have a good operation, they have to keep replacing those. So the actual business of making more colonies, splitting colonies out and requeening them and producing good quality queens is big business here. And some other related services that some beekeepers do, the demand for education in the world of beekeeping is pretty high right now. And so mentoring and teaching classes and doing field days and things like that, there's always demand for that. And selling equipment for bees. We recently got a new equipment warehouse down in Lakeland, Man Lake Supply, and so that is helping out, and we have a supplier that comes to our association every month that also brings supplies in. So it's not like you can go to the local Walmart and pick up bee stuff. So these services are really valuable to us as beekeepers. Also, because we now have African and Africanized bees in Florida that tend to nest in really odd and inconvenient places, there is a high demand for bee removal services. And so we need qualified, insured individuals that can come and safely remove bees from people's structures and playgrounds and things like that. So as a beekeeper, some of the things we do is, of course, we inspect hives every couple of weeks, and I'm going to show you a few things that we're looking for when we are inspecting hives. Okay. So this is a typical Langstroth bee box here. And this is an outer cover that protects the beehive from the elements. This is an inner cover, and that helps provide some insulation, and most importantly, it keeps the outer cover from sticking to the box itself, so we don't have to tear up the lid as much. So when we're in beehives, we're actually looking for a few specific things. One, we're checking for the queen to see if she's in there. We're looking for pests and diseases. Something, if we found something like this American Foulbrood, ew, that would be very bad and very scary. We're looking to make sure we have good brood patterns, and so something like this we'd be pretty happy with. And so we're looking for baby bees, and we're seeing if there are any eggs in there. A lot of times when we're in a hive, we don't actually see the queen. All the new beekeepers look for the queen, and they're really disappointed when they don't see her. But a lot of times what we will see is eggs and baby bees. And you can tell by the size of those baby bees about how old they are. So we know we've had a queen in there in the past day if there's an egg, or a couple of days if there's a tiny little brood in there. And we're looking for honey stores. So a honey frame would look something like this. And we would want to make sure that the bees have enough food for feeding the baby bees and surviving through whatever season they're in. And here is an illustration of how much bigger the queen would be than the other bees. So sometimes you can spot her. Young kids are actually the best at spotting the queen. And we're looking for things like pollen, and that looks like weird little multicolored yellow cells inside of the the frames, because if we don't see enough pollen, we may have to feed the bees something extra so they have something to feed their brood. And here is an example of a plastic frame that we would use inside of a hive. And here's the entrance on the hive. The bees go in and out. And we usually keep about 10 frames inside of a hive like that. And so we are inspecting to make sure that the colony is healthy. We're inspecting to see that they have enough space in there, because if there's not enough space for them to store honey, and if there's not enough space for them to reproduce and build a healthy, strong colony, they'll split and they'll swarm, and then we lose most of our colony and we have to requeen or hope that they do a good job of requeening it themselves. But we have a lot of challenges here in Central Florida because we have Africanized bees. So you don't know who the queen is going to go out and cavort with, and so you could end up with some pretty cranky bees. The camera's still on. It's showing over there.
No, I moved it.
Okay.
It's lagging.
Okay. So I wanted to talk a minute about what's going on with all of the bees, because usually new beekeepers especially, and a lot of people that I talk with in the general public are really concerned about the plight of the bees and the so-called pollinator apocalypse, and is this real, and what's really going on, and do we need to ban all of the pesticides? And so I wanted to cover just a little bit about some of the threats to pollinators that they're facing right now and that we're facing in terms of management decisions. So one of the very big ones is loss of habitat, because what do bees eat? They eat flower nectar. If there are no flowers, then they don't have suitable habitat. So as more and more agricultural areas and natural habitats that used to provide floral sources for bees are now being converted to developed area, then we're really having a hard time, finding places to put bees and finding places that have enough forage. And with the citrus greening disease that came into Florida in recent years, we lost a lot of citrus groves, and it all happened very quickly. And that used to be a source of major forage for a lot of bees, and now a lot of those groves are gone. So beekeepers are having a hard time finding areas that are rich enough in floral habitat. And then, of course, there are pesticides, and we can't deny that insecticides have an impact on lots of different kinds of insects, including honeybees. And so we're talking about everything from your backyard to large croplands to the mosquito control sprays, that are for human health protection, and also even the pesticides that are used in beehives. So as beekeepers, one of the things that is not talked about a lot is the fact that we have to use some sort of control measures to control the varroa mites inside of hives. And so some of the things that some beekeepers choose to put in their hives are actually quite toxic to honeybees, and they have the potential to end up in wax stores or even in honey. So it's very important to examine all of the different methods that bees could be exposed to pesticides and the impacts that they could have. And so sometimes it's very direct, if a bee is sprayed with a toxic insecticide, there can be acute effects, or it might be very indirect in that, they drink contaminated water, or multiple pesticides that they're exposed to have synergistic effects. And when we say pesticides, we're not just talking about insecticides that are aimed at killing insects, but we're also talking about fungicides to kill fungus in the grass, and herbicides to kill weeds, and bactericides, which are sprayed all over a lot of citrus groves nowadays. And the different types of toxicity can vary, and some types of pesticides may kill adult bees, but a lot of times the effects are more like on the brood, like the brood won't hatch, or the brood won't do as well, or the queen won't lay as many eggs. And so with recent research, we're finding out a lot more about the wide variety of impacts that pesticides can actually have on bees. And not just our managed European honeybees, but also native bees as well. And so when we talk about pests and the threats that they pose, the biggest one is really varroa mites. Although there are a wide variety of pests that honeybees can get, the one that's killing our hives is varroa mites. And up here in the corner, that is a varroa mite. So it's a parasite that attaches to the bee itself and sucks the life right out of it. But even worse, at the same time, it's giving the bee a multitude of viral diseases. And some of these viral diseases cause the bees to either come out of the cells with deformed wings or unattached wings, and they'll crawl around the hive and be very confused, and they'll never have a productive life. So the viruses with the mites, it's a lethal combination. So it's very hard to combat these as a beekeeper. We also have African honeybees and Africanized honeybees, which are hybridized with European honeybees. And they do, in some cases, compete for space, but this is more of an issue for beekeepers because they're very undesirable for beekeeping because they keep much smaller colonies. They're much more defensive of their hives, so they're not very fun to keep. And they also want to swarm about 15 times per year, which makes it very, very difficult to manage them and keep them in their hives. And so, as beekeepers, bees can leave anytime they feel like, unlike other types of livestock. And so with the bees, it's a particular challenge to create an environment for them, a home for them, so that they don't want to leave. And that's a lot harder to do if you have Africanized genetics in your European colonies. So it's really important for those of us in South Florida and Central Florida, where we have a lot of Africanized bees, to obtain good stock when we're getting our bees and our queens. And so, on the good side, Africanized honeybees, there are a lot of feral colonies that are out there, and they're still performing pollination services, but they're not good for beekeeping in general because they're very difficult to manage and they're not nice. And they also tend to invade human spaces a lot more frequently. So another challenge to bees and pollinators of all types in general is climate change, and this has some very big impacts and impacts that sometimes are hard to measure. But with climate change, we are seeing new pests all of the time. We're seeing more extreme weather events from droughts and floods and hurricanes, extreme temperatures, changing seasons. And with that, the timing of bloom seasons and honey seasons is shifting a little bit, changing floral sources. So some things are growing in areas where they weren't, and some things are not growing in areas where they were, and sometimes this is good, sometimes this is bad, but these are all effects of climate change. And within the beekeeping world in the US, we're dealing with a lack of genetic diversity. So some of the European honeybees that we have are from the same stock that were brought here, even hundreds of years ago, and we're concerned that our genetic pool is getting too small. And for European honeybees, of course, we're talking about commercial beekeeping and moving the bees around and maybe not being able to provide them with adequate nutrition, especially if it's a monoculture agricultural crop that doesn't have high nutrition value. So I want to bring up the point that if we are only depending on European honeybees, which we're all very fond of, I'm a beekeeper, I love honey, and only honeybees produce honey. But if we're only depending on them for crop pollination and we lose honeybees, like we continue to lose them, either to diseases or other pests and factors, then what? And so there is this concept called integrated crop pollination, where we're really starting to encourage agricultural producers, as well as, people like you in your backyards and parks departments and things like that, to really look at how can we create more habitat and preserve more habitat for some of our wild pollinators, because we do have over 300 species of native Florida bees here. And even though they're not in as high of numbers as honeybees can be, they're still incredibly valuable. And in some cases, they're even more effective pollinators than honeybees are. So for example, like bumblebees are really good pollinators of blueberries. And squash bees are great pollinators of squash. Also, many wild bees will forage in conditions that honeybees simply won't, different temperatures and weather conditions. And so I want to point out a few things that we can do to help pollinators. And this is at the backyard level, at the beekeeper level, at the agriculturist level. These are things that everybody, I think, can really look at and make an impact, because, it's not all hopeless, even though that big long list of challenges, sounds really overwhelming. Everybody can do something to help pollinators. And so really evaluating your pesticide use. And, over the years, I've talked to thousands of, homeowners and gardeners who at first are like, oh, I really don't use pesticides. Oh, except for, the ant bait and the Roundup. And, and then if you were to look in their garage, they would have an entire shelf full of stuff that they're not really thinking of as pesticides, but they're actually pesticides, and they can have the potential to harm pollinators and other beneficial insects. So really looking at, why are you using them? Do you need to use them? Have you properly identified the problem so that you know how to treat it correctly? And if you do end up needing to use pesticides, don't treat any flowering plants. Don't spray when it's windy. Don't apply if rain is expected, where it could, puddle and potentially be available to insects. Don't ever use pesticide dusts, because they are more persistent and they'll blow around to places that they shouldn't be and expose more beneficials in the process. Always look for pollinator warnings on the pesticide labels, but also be aware that a lot of things haven't been studied and therefore warnings are not there. And so just kind of operate on the assumption that if it's a pesticide, even if it's an organic or botanical pesticide, it can still harm pollinators. So even things like, BT and spinosad and neem, all of those are lower impact for humans. I drink neem tea, but it will kill my bees if I put it directly on them. So we really have to be careful about everything that we use out in the garden and landscape. And this is a big one. We all, as individuals living in this world, need to work together to conserve pollinator habitats. So some of those pollinator habitats might be on a very small scale in your own backyard, or maybe your neighborhood, and you might have the potential to plant a pollinator garden or even a median. And also farms and ranches provide incredibly valuable habitat for not only pollinators, but lots of wildlife and lots of native plant species. And these farms and ranches, yes, they're agricultural production properties, but they also host a huge range of wildlife, including, bazillions of pollinators to be exact. Parks of all types and all sizes can serve as great pollinator habitat, and also larger conservation lands, conservation easements and, larger parks, trails. So when it comes to creating pollinator habitat, one of the things that a lot of times people don't really think about is the ground nesting sites for some of the native bees. So here we're not talking about honeybees, but we like all of the bees, so I did throw this slide in there. So a lot of ground nesting bees are solitary. They just need a little bit of soil space. So if you're willing to keep a little bit of soil space for them, that is really valuable for them. And of course, there are the cute little bee habitat tunnel nesting houses. And you may have seen weird little corners cut out of your flowers. This is a leaf cutter bee. And they cut nice, perfect little circles and ovals out. And then they line their tubes with them and lay an egg inside each of the little cells. Pack it with food so that when the egg hatches, the larva has something to eat. And cute little bee nest boxes should be put into the shade, and plan on changing out those tubes or those bamboo things or logs or boards every year or so to prevent disease buildup in those cells. And of course, the native plant people know all about planting for pollinators, and I've got big long lists of, some of my favorite native plants for pollinators that I'd be happy to share. And when it comes to landscaping for pollinators, always look to see what's actually out there, because you might find out that something that looks pretty insignificant might be a valuable pollinator food source, and, scout around your yard for potential bee nest sites. And generally, the more species of plants you have, the more pollinator species you're going to bring in. Color clusters can help, but let's be real, we're gardeners, we like one of everything out there. But the goal should be to have something blooming throughout the year if possible, especially during the winter season and the summer season, when a lot of floral sources are pretty sparse. And a couple other landscape maintenance tips if you're planting for pollinators is let your wildflowers reseed, don't over mulch, and know your caterpillar seasons, because butterflies are valuable pollinators as well, and a lot of the larval plants like your passion vines shouldn't be pruned out when there are caterpillars on them, obviously. And in my opinion, a good pollinator plant in a landscape is going to serve multiple purposes. So I usually find things that are valuable both as nectar plants and pollen plants, but also, maybe a butterfly larval plant or something that provides fruit for birds after it's done blooming. And it should serve a function for you too, especially if you're in a small landscape. It can be a screening plant, it can give shade, it can look pretty, it can provide a natural fence, and try to get things that last multiple seasons, and avoid things that spread really aggressively, like some of the, seaside goldenrod, unless you have acres and acres of it, because you don't want your pollinator to garden to become unmanageable. And of course, you all know where you can find native plants. And if anybody is interested in learning more about the ins and outs of beekeeping and some of the more specifics on, physical requirements and how much is it going to cost and time requirements and things like that, we do have a free online class coming up next week called Beekeeping, Is It For Me? And that's a 2-hour class online. It's free, and you can learn all about what it takes to become a beekeeper. It is legal to keep bees in Florida. It's regulated by the Florida Department of Agriculture, so that means that cities and counties cannot regulate beekeeping or tell you that you can't have it. If you live in an HOA, you do have to make sure that their regulations allow hives, because HOA rules somehow supersede state rules. So that is something to be aware of. And I will point out that the Kissimmee Valley Beekeepers Association here in Osceola County We host events, and there are a lot of online resources and videos on that website there. And I believe that is all I have. Thank you for letting me join you tonight.
So this has been the Pine Lily chapter of the Florida Native Plant Society first ever online meeting. Get my camera focused. So I hope everyone enjoyed it. Apologies for the initial snafus. And please email me your feedback, communications@fnps.org. Okay, I think that's it. Our president is Karina Vaudry. I hope she was able to attend this meeting. Okay. Bye, everyone.